Hello and welcome to another episode of the War Report where we're coming off of probably much more interesting pre-show conversation, but perhaps one day those archives will be released, but that is not today. Of course, I'm joined by GSP, and we have quite a bit of ground to cover. Now, the next week or so might be spotty because we actually both do have travel plans unrelated to each other, believe it or not. We're not, unfortunately, we
Mhm.
are not going on a world spanning adventure together. That would be fun, but that's not in the cards right now. So if the next week or two is a bit spotty with episodes, my apologies in advance. We'll certainly keep up as much as we can, and I will keep you posted on when that's going to be and when you can expect new episodes to be out. But without further ado, let's get into the Forgotten War of Ukraine.
Yes. Just some quick news. As usual, I like to start with the South. So, for at least a week, and this includes today, Ukraine has launched all kinds of Scalp missiles from France, Neptunes, which I think are either British or British slash Ukrainian,
British.
and of course, are they? Yes, and then the British Storm Shadows. Now, one of the things that I think has become apparent is that the air defense system around Crimea has become extremely good, and more planes have been downed, but also destroyed at airports, including a military air force base that was hit, and several secondary, tertiary explosions occurred just outside of Dnipropetrovsk. And there's another event that happens there today, which I'll get into later. Um, but this is to say that there's been some kind of a stepping up. Like something has happened with the Russians. I know that they're using some kind of um, analog to the A-50 plane, which I don't understand why they didn't begin using that at the start of the war. It just boggles my mind. There's a lot of things, about the Russian military that kind of boggle my mind that they could have done early on. Um, in any case, it seems that they have become more proficient at this. However, there was a strike that was successful and hit an ammo depot just today, just hours ago. And this is in an area I literally remember when back in the days of the Novorosiyans in 2014, when they captured this bit of land. If people remember what the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics looked like, it was like this little wedge shape with this like long line going down. Well, there was a time where they didn't control that area. And at one time, they did get close to approaching Mariupol, maybe taking Mariupol. But in hindsight, I think that would have been a much more difficult battle. But even then, you look at videos, and I've watched some videos over the weekend, and the amount of forces that both sides were committing were far like a fraction of today's, right? Um, Yeah, so this was at the Yarovovsky training ground. This is uh, where in the Lvov region. This is another hit. Sorry, I forgot to mention. So you guys remember March 10th, 2022, they hit that. Well, they've hit that area again. So and I believe that was on November the 3rd. But let me get you the information on the hit that happened on the Azov Sea. I just want to get the name of the town right. It is literally the town over the border from the rest of Russia, as opposed to Donbass or the Russian-controlled part of Donbass. Uh, Sorry, and then we'll get into the maps and everything. Darn it. Yes. Now, there were rumors because the attacks on Crimea focused on the Kerch Bridge area. There's a military naval port there. There were rumors that a Russian ship was damaged, but the rumors proved to be untrue. The satellite images indicate no damage to the boats there or to the immediate vicinity around it. So it what probably happened is a missile was destroyed over this area and the debris landed in the waters around it. Um, Sorry, almost there, I promise. Yes, here it is. Um, Sedovo. So Sedovo is now it was quite an explosion. So this is 100 kilometers from the front line. If you like, I can share it with you. Um, Send it to you right now to get like an approximate idea where this is from Donetsk City. So, this is an area they weren't covering. I suppose that the Russians felt safe there for quite some time. You can see how it's relatively close to Mariupol, right? But yes, a rather large explosion happened there today. Um, and now I'm going to get you the maps and I'll start with the south as I usually do. Um, and it's going to take me a second because this is sort of like uh, kind of the big news that's been happening uh, in the south, in the Kherson region, and it's the development is it's not good. The Russians have they have replaced their former commander with Lapin. Lapin was the guy that was in charge of the Kharkov area that he ceded last November. He replaces, I believe, Makaryevich. So it's Teplinsky, sorry, General Teplinsky. We've seen his name before, and the area that we're talking about, this is what it kind of looked like when things started to kind of go bad. Um, Now, it's not. I brought it up in the last show. It's not an area where the Ukrainians are able to move very heavy equipment, right? But that doesn't mean it's not deadly, and that doesn't mean it doesn't impact the front line. So this is kind of what it looked like, what they took over, and then I have some maps that kind of show in greater detail, or I'll do like a post by post of like how this developed. Okay, so this is sort of, you could say, like on day one. This is in the Krinky area. And then that developed into this. And then this area, further entrenched themselves. Now, I feel like the way Dima explained it was very good. This is kind of like a blow up of this region according to his mapping. But I'd like to focus attention because the Russians have not been able to move the Ukrainians out of there. The Ukrainians have expanded their control of Krinky, which is this long, narrow town on the edges of the Dnieper, with this huge island that has little lakes and rivers running through it next to it. Um, I did see a video of 9 troops from the Russians moving into this area, somewhere between 9 and 10 or 7 to 10. That's what it felt like to me. In the video, one of them is shot. He's wounded. He falls down. The rest of the guys scramble to the ground, and I feel like there was like 7 or 8 of them. So we're talking about a decent sized squad, probably like half a platoon size. and they're pinned down. And then immediately the Ukrainians show off with their FPV drones, and they slaughtered them. So it's half a platoon gone in very short time. Now, this is Teplinsky that's in charge of this, right? Makarevich is the guy who replaced him because he was having large losses trying to untrench the Ukrainians from this region. But he hasn't made it possible. Now, as we continue to look at Dima's map, the other interest, I'm going to bring up a map that kind of shows where this is happening in a larger context and explain the situation probably a little bit better. Okay. So in this latest map, you can see that the Russians are bombing slightly east of this area, all the towns. Now, they've been bombing them relentlessly along this whole area for months because they don't want the Ukrainians to have forces concentrating there. And you can see, and you're asking yourself, well, why aren't they bombing around Krinky, right? Probably because it's a question of shortage of aircraft. They have to commit more aircraft, or they need more munitions for their aircraft to bomb both areas simultaneously. Because if they shift their focus to Krinky, the area that they are bombing, in this larger area, as you can see, Ukrainians are going to come down. Another detail that's important for those Russian soldiers that were massacred in that area is they were shot moving into a forest line that everyone assumed the Russians actually controlled. So that means the Ukrainians already have DRG units in this area, that they've penetrated actually a lot further. Now, the area around Novokhovka, the Ukrainians have not managed to budge. They've been there for ages, but they've reached their limit, right? As I've said, it's very hard to get heavy machinery across the river. Like, do you know what I mean? This like eventually they'll come to a point where there's very little that they can do. Okay, because they simply, as weak as this war and the Gaza war, which we'll get into, has proven tanks and other armored vehicles to be, well, vulnerable. Vulnerable would be a better word. You still need them. You still need them, and they need their own protection.
Yes, and I actually think
And
one of the biggest takeaways about armored warfare is we're at a point where, although in many ways the war in Ukraine does look like I know, the overused World War One style situation, that these tanks can't just attack each other in waves of tanks versus waves of tanks as one might typically think of it. That they need infantry escorts, that they need people who are going to demine any territory, especially for any anti-tank mines, where it needs to be an integrated effort between infantry and armored forces.
yeah, so that's the Kherson area. Now, fighting in the Robotino area, the Ukrainians have to. Now, as we said in previous shows in the last few weeks, they've lost some territory in the southern part of the Robotino front. The Russians regained access to a road from there because they've captured some trenches. The Russians also captured an area of a trench that was close to Verbove, but the Ukrainians in the last 2 days have managed to push west of Robotino towards Kupani. All these are very small changes. It's not. It's it's an intense battle, but it's not dynamic in the same way. And much could be said the same thing about the Vremevsky Ledge on the border between Zaporozhye and Donetsk. The Russians have made some small gains in this area as well. I saw a very impressive video where one Russian squad, about 9-10 guys, clears out uh, 4 different trenches. Of course, the prelude to this is artillery fire, mortar, and FPV drones before they do this. Now, of course, the really hot battle that's been happening since October 10th and 11th has been the battle for Avdeevka. So I'm going to show you like what kind of progress has been happening there um, in the last few weeks. Okay, so this will give you kind of an idea, mm, kind of where things were when they managed to get the waste heap across the railroad tracks from the coke plant. Okay, and where they had to reconquer some of the territories that they had gained and lost on the 10th and the 11th. So there's that. Um, Now I'll show you how that developed further. And you can see these are very hot, contested areas that they're fighting for. And then where was it? I think the last one also shows you the area in the north where they've captured some more territory. Here's another example. Um, this area is very important in the north because they need this buffer zone. Going over the tracks uh, needs to be done in such a way that they don't leave the northern flank vulnerable. It will also force the Ukrainians to move their artillery further away from where they're fighting. And in the western part, sorry, in the southern part of the Avdiivka front, you can see the areas that they had lost, I believe, in September and October, and then they not only retook them, but they took more territory in this area. This was a particularly successful day for them. Might have been in November, early November, second or third, maybe. This is another one of the waste heap, and you can see how they've expanded their control in this area. And then today and yesterday in the south, there was just this territory that was taken, which is just a small area. Um, the Russians had trouble for quite a while in Voyodne and I think it's Pervomayorsk. Let me see. Yeah, Pervomayarsk. No, Pervomaisk. So this is an area in Pervomaisk where they recently acquired territory. So you can see that they're trying to expand their zone of control. There is, I believe, around 9 kilometers or 8 kilometers between the pincers, right? Um, there are reports now coming in from various Western sources where Ukrainians, and I'm not talking just about Zaluzhny, because we'll get into it. Zaluzhny was interviewed with The Economist, and Zelensky was interviewed, I believe, by the New York Times, if I'm not mistaken.
There was the no, that one's in the interview, but there was the scathing Time magazine article that we will definitely have to give
Time,
a look.
yes, it was Time.
Oh yeah,
Nobody
yes, that is the
believes.
one.
Yes,
They put some of these things out. It's easy to get them mixed up, but
yes, and then Der Spiegel had this article that came out that I'll read you. The Russian army is a terrible enemy. We are tired. We must somehow find new forces. Interestingly, I believe it was The Economist and Time, both of them mentioned the lack of forces for Ukraine. Interesting that they mentioned it. The Valiant group, which is what the Russians called their forces in the north, uh, Ukraine at the stage of the war, character matters. We are exhausted, just like the Russians, but there are more of them, and they have more equipment. This is a difficult thing, and what we miss is people. The soldiers were accustomed to danger, but a year and a half of war left its mark even on physically unharmed men. I thought that was a very interesting admonition. Once we had a shootout which lasted 20 hours, nonstop fighting, attacks, evacuation. Somehow I survived it. We've all been through this somehow, but we are no longer fresh. We somehow need to find new strength. But winter is approaching, and with cold weather and bad weather, and it seems that there is no end to this war. An interesting statement coming from him, and of course, there's a huge row. I guess we could talk about it now um, between Zelensky and Zelensky. Um, Zelensky basically said that the war is in a stalemate. Um, he says we need new weapons. He didn't say Wunderwaffen, but he's basically saying we need new weapons because the Russians have adapted, so on and so on. They have more forces, they have more men, very much echoing what this soldier said in the Der Spiegel article. Uh, the question is, does the world can they give a package the kind that they gave in 2023? It would have to be even bigger, right? Because I think it's dawned on them that they will need something much, much larger, right? The whole point of the summer offensive, and Zelensky talks about this. He says, in 4 months, I thought I would be able to reach the Sea of Azov and Crimea. I thought I thought it was possible. He literally says that.
So he really
Uh,
bought into the propaganda campaign, and I mean, unless this is just a really strong performance, a really strong front, which, judging by what I saw of it, I don't think it is, but I know that's what they had the shills, the NAFO type saying that we're going to reach the Azov Sea, that we're going to be on Crimea's doorstep by summer's end. But to hear that from Zelensky, to hear that from somebody you would think that should know better, that is actually a bit surprising, like I said. And I mean, obviously everything's a piece of rhetoric, but yeah, that's.
well, remember his previous statements? We don't have enough.
Oh, yes.
He's contradicting himself. He already, like, last year this time he was outlining what he needed for the counteroffensive. I need 300 to 350 to 375 tanks. I need 1,000 armored personnel slash infantry fighting vehicles. I need this. I need that. Uh, he got them one way or another. He got them. Maybe they came a bit late, but to be honest, you know, trying the offensive in June instead of May, I don't think was a stupid idea. Um, the roads were still pretty bad in the first half of May, and the fighting for Bakhmut was still going on. So I think, going in June was probably a good decision. According to him, not all the material that he needed for the counteroffensive had arrived. Now, they have burned uh, through their Leopards. 25 new Leopards have been given to them by Germany this week. I should also mention in the Kupiansk direction, the Russians have regained some territory that they lost, and there was very the fighting in this one region was particularly brutal for both sides. It is an area where the Ukrainians also lost two Leopards, but the Russians also lost quite a bit of armor as well. And I should also mention that in the Ugledar area, uh, east of Pavlovka, another another kind of disaster. The Russians wanted to make a break to capture some territory in the South Donetsk region. This is outside of Donetsk city. Um, if I find the map, I'll send it to you. But It was I mean, just a terrible, terrible decision to make. Um, because, oh yes, here it is. So I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Okay, so so you can see the Ukrainian icon and the Russian icon. To the left of that, and near the corner, is Ugledar, or as the Ukrainians call it, Vugledar. Um, this is in a town called Mikitske. At least that's the way the Ukrainians have written. So they were planning to go for an attack. They sent a relatively small column of 5 armored vehicles. 4 of the 5 are destroyed. Uh, Heavy losses. I mean, for a reconnaissance in force. And then there's a 2-day pause, and they did the same thing again. It just so like the fighting is very intense, and I think if the Ukrainians are going to switch to an active defense, it's not going to be a cakewalk until they start like really starting to run out of ammo and machinery. And that is to return back to the Zelensky debate. Um, that is one other thing that Zelensky was furious with Zelensky, was for him to call this a stalemate, and that maybe an active defense would be better. Um, but to be honest, ever since late August, early September, there were already calls to begin fortifications around Odessa. I remember seeing those. I think what has angered Zelensky is that he said this in The Economist, and The Economist is like extremely pro-gay, extremely pro-Ukraine. Um, but it can also be um, very much a realist publication. It does not. I think when the chips are down, it's more likely to be realistic than say a publication maybe like The Guardian or The Washington Post.
Something like The
In my
Economist
experience,
is now, of course, we all know the relationship between media and the regime. I don't think we really need to rehash that, but The Economist is one of their off-ramp outlets. If they want out of something, if they want to weasel their way out of something, they put out something in The Economist to explain this or to soften the blow.
mm, yeah. So yes, yes, but they are more realistic, I find overall. They're gung ho at the beginning, and then they're more realistic about when things aren't going well. Um, but there was also I saw this on what's his name, the dude, something like the Taiga,
Baron of the Taiga.
Baron of the Taiga had something very interesting. He watched an interview on the Hoover Institute with Kotkin. Kotkin is this very anti-Russian guy. He's from the region. I don't know if he's Ukrainian Jewish background or not, but it's Stefan Kotkin. Way back at the beginning of the war, I did I did see some interviews with him, but that was back in early 2022. Anyways, he had to say on the show, the Poles are not going to send people, the Germans are not going to send people, and the Ukrainians are running out of people. Interesting. So now there are several articles, mainstream, Economist, Time Magazine, New York Times, echoing this stuff. Um,
I'd say I'm
we
really
need an
having to eat.
armistice.
I'm really having to eat my hat on this Poland getting involved thing. Uh, I mean, look, don't get me wrong. Just as a whole, I'm glad that this war is not escalating. But I
Yeah.
I was almost certain that they were going to pull this out. And honestly, if you would have asked me at any time before October 7th, I would have said, "Oh, absolutely, they're going to escalate this war." But I know it's a take that has been made a million times, at least at this point, but
Yeah,
it really is that America cannot sustain two war efforts on its current trajectory. Now, one could argue that America could have more of a wartime economy, but that's going to be a hard sell for people to make sacrifice when the nation itself is not at war. Now, some people might make the argument that we're going to see more direct involvement. I don't believe that. I would have to see a lot more escalation before I think that would be the case for a direct American involvement either in the Middle East or in Europe or frankly anywhere else in the world at that point. But it really is that given current military production, one statistic that never fails to amaze me is that American shell production in 2022 was less than what Austria-Hungary, probably the weakest of the great powers during World War One, had in 1914. And that
yeah,
was after the outbreak of the war. American shell production is still below that. Now you could argue different type of weaponry, different shells. I get that, but just painting with broad brush strokes here, I think the point still stands with that. And
yeah.
Europe certainly is not going to be able to make up that shortfall, especially considering the fact European resources will also be diverted towards Israel because they are at the beck and call of the American Empire. And as we all know, American industry, well, excuse me, European industry has been crushed by America, especially after the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. They're not going to be able to boot up war industry. Even the most industrious countries in Europe, say France, Germany, etc., are not going to be able to provide that. Turkey, which is probably the only NATO member that still has stockpiles on very uncertain terms, and they're certainly not going to arm Israel despite Israeli-Turkish relations. They are very
Mhm.
sour right now. Now, I think if Erdogan remains in power, which I don't see any reason why he wouldn't, that will continue to be the case, and that it would take a lot of shifts just around the world for him to snake on his current partners. Look, I know the man bounces back and forth, but just given the position he's worked himself into, given the absolute stance of Washington on these issues, that bridge has been burned for the foreseeable future, at least in my estimation. But I'll touch more on that later
Yeah,
when we actually get into the Middle East. But simply
yeah.
put,
So he could,
in order to support both Ukraine and Israel, you would need a wartime economy out of America. Now, maybe not as
yeah,
drastic as total war, maybe not like what we had during the World Wars, but you would need a significant government coordinated effort of military industry in order to reach production numbers to sustain both of these war efforts.
yeah. And he continues. Kotkin does. We need an armistice. That's the one of the hosts says, "How do we get the armistice?" And he says, "You've got to put pressure on the regime in Moscow to think that it could fall if it continues this war. That will only happen if there is a rival regime on the horizon, defectors, groups of defectors, covert operations. Like that's a major cope. That's a major cope. But that's not going to happen. Um, yeah, it's just not. Um, so, there right now, it could be the beginning of a turning point. A lot of people have speculated that the Russians are going to go for something in the winter if things freeze over. Now, I would have to say, if we have a winter like last year, I don't think so. If we have a colder winter, I would still say that in the south, in the Zaporozhye and Kherson front, you're not going to see that level of freezing, of hardening of the ground. Um, it will become a little bit harder. Maybe the Ukrainians will feel more emboldened by that, but they have sent a lot of troops in the Kherson area. There are a lot of heavy concentrations there. Um, the other bit of news that has happened, and it has um, that has really affected um, current morale, is there was an award ceremony in a town just south of Dnepropetrovsk. Now, you know, in one sense, you could say it was near the front lines, but it's not really that. From what I've seen, they look like they're over 50 kilometers away, maybe even more. And So there, uh, basically, what had happened was there was an award ceremony, and um, the Russians attacked. They sent missiles into this area, and you had even a lieutenant colonel that was killed. The number was first 20 killed, then it went to 22. Ukrainian media started to report on it, including Zelensky. And so the death toll now is around 28. There are videos of this hit. Um, Russians also have been focusing a lot in Dnipropetrovsk. They hit an area that has NASAMS anti-aircraft missile systems. Uh, this area had secondary explosions, which means there was also munitions. But a lot of people were very upset about uh, why was there an award ceremony? Why was it taking place there? It should have been further away. Even that guy Ilya Ponomarenko, he says it's just unbelievable. At least 20 Ukrainian troops with the 128th Infantry were killed in a Russian missile strike. The command mustered many troops in one place in the open for an artillery day decoration ceremony. The result is the tragedy. It's absolutely wild that such things can still happen 20 months into a full-scale war with Russia. And then he says, just pure Soviet-style snafu mess, and certain heads must now finally roll. Interesting. So that was the other bit of major news that happened. That was on the 4th of November. And then we also have news of um, from NBC. U.S. European officials broached topic of peace negotiations with Ukraine. Sources say again, it's an you know anonymous individuals within the Pentagon and Biden's administration are saying that there are that that the West is trying to get Ukraine to essentially sue for peace or get some kind of an armistice. So we might be close to the end of this war. It's a real possibility.
I mean, I think the big question. I agree with you, by the way, with what you just said about being close to the end of the war. That is a very real possibility, and I would actually say that. And perhaps I'm putting too much weight on the Middle Eastern situation, but I would say that given everything else that's going on, Ukraine has become an afterthought. It's become an
Hmm.
embarrassment in
Hmm.
many circles, even among the quote unquote elite circles. It has become an embarrassment that they weren't able to crush this Russia that they propagandized about being a third world gas station, being weak, being a has been power, all the things that you've heard for the past 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
But with that, you do have to wonder about the politics inside of Kiev. Now, we had discussed earlier the rival between Zelensky and Zaluzhny, who is still, keep in mind, head of the Ukrainian armed forces. That still hasn't changed. It's not like he's been dismissed. This is a man still within the war effort, still within the wartime cabinet, where I know it's not exactly a cabinet position, but I think you all get the point I'm trying to get here. And he's already openly going against the head of state, which does not bode well for unity. Even though he hasn't done anything against Zelensky or the Ukrainian state yet, and perhaps this is full bias speaking, I'm willing to admit if it is. But I would say alone, the fact that Zelensky is taking such a hard and critical line against Zelensky, that's far worse optics than whatever happened with Wagner over the summer in Russia. That's by all means, but you do have to wonder how stable Kiev can stay if that is the case. And of course, you have Arestovych, who has declared his intention to run for president as well. And what he's been saying for the past several months, especially within the recent weeks when he floated around the idea and more or less gave his unofficial announcement that he would be running, is that Ukraine needs to take a much more defensive posture in this war, that we're not going to get these territories back, and that total victory is a lie. It's something we're never going to get. But you have to wonder, with that position, with Zelensky, with the admission that they do plan on trying to hold elections in 2024, which that would be, I believe, in March 2024. So we're looking at 4 months from now that Ukraine could potentially have elections under wartime conditions. Which case, I think that's just a convoluted way of saying that Zelensky has served his purpose and that he's being dismissed. Now,
Hmm.
perhaps he'll get a golden parachute and he'll get to come to the U.S. and run some sort of think tank or NGO, or perhaps he'll languish in some sort of Ukrainian prison and be dragged through the court system. Perhaps he'll meet his final end at the hands of his own people or actors within his own government. I don't know. There's a lot of possibilities here. We need to get closer to the election to see what that result is. But I would say almost certainly, if they're going to try to hold elections, that is shorthand for Zelensky has completely lost favor with the regime and that he is on his way out. But with that being said, if between now and March 2024, with Zelensky's, I guess you could say, lame duck term, are there elements in Kiev that are going to tolerate any sort of negotiation or settlement? I don't think so. Mind you, this is the same regime that banned negotiating with Russia while Putin is still in power until certain conditions are met. And this is the regime that has arrested and executed its own negotiators on that token. So I have a hard time believing that if Zelensky were to concede to the pressure, that there wouldn't be elements even that are beyond the control of, say, the State Department, CIA, the American Empire, just for the sake of brevity, that wouldn't try to find some way to force this war effort to continue. And perhaps that could come from somebody like Zelensky, even though, once again, his position has been rather fickle to say the least, but there's certainly elements within Ukraine that would love to fight this war until the last Ukrainian, which, given the split attention of the American Empire, is becoming impossible because if they can't send the arms, there's no war effort. If they can't send the billions of dollars in aid, the Ukrainian economy is bound to completely implode in on itself. To quote Orban from, I believe it was sometime last year, he said that Ukraine is a completely insolvent nation, only kept online by
Yes.
foreign aid. And I not to give too much credit to Orban for that insight. Not that I don't like him, but once again, it doesn't take a genius to see that. It doesn't take somebody with great political insight to realize that. But it does take somebody who is willing to go against the grain to actually come out and say it. In which case, I will give him credit for that much. But it's not a very astute observation. It's just something that's uh, was or was taboo to say, that a line you weren't allowed to cross for the longest time. But it looks like we are starting to get to that point. But I have a hard time believing that Zelensky can maintain any credibility or even legitimacy at that point if he does try to enter into peace negotiations, in which case, I mean, I don't want to say this for certain is going to happen, but what way is there to end this war on Russia's terms without a complete capitulation to the Russians and not
Hmm.
some sort of ceasefire, not some sort of agreement? And I mean, we've already seen, this is months old news, that the minute there's a ceasefire, the minute that the conflict it comes to at least a temporary resolution, Ukraine's on track for NATO membership in order to really set that trap again. In which case, you've motivated the Russians to never sue for peace and fight until there's unconditional surrender. And we're getting to the point that if there is, and I don't want to be too drastic, but I think we're closer to it than we've been since the beginning of the war. If there is a complete collapse of state in Ukraine, I would say that's as good as an unconditional surrender, assuming Russia can take advantage of the situation and seize the necessary modes of power, whether it be actual strategic areas, whether it be symbolic areas, etc. But it could be the opportunity that the Kremlin has been waiting for the complete implosion of the Ukrainian state, because I do think at least part of the war effort going in is that they did expect a much swifter collapse of Ukraine, not realizing how much their state apparatus had been strengthened by the West over the past 8 years. I do think that the Russians underestimated the Ukrainians in that part. But and look, I don't want to say this is going to happen for certain, but we're looking at the very real possibility of just a complete implosion of state power, of central authority in Ukraine. In which case, that's the closest I think you're going to get to a victory, because I doubt that the Ukrainians would even be allowed to unconditionally surrender to Russia, even if they wanted to.
Hmm. Yeah, I sent you another picture of like the latest territory that the Russians also took, just north of, just to finish off the Avdiivka area. It is an important area because it's along the railroad tracks. Anyways, and I should also mention in that NBC article uh, that divulges both American sources and European sources that Zelensky has already been told to begin negotiations. I should stress that means negotiations for land. Like they're telling him, give up the territories. You're not going to take them back. That's the extent of the negotiations. That's the crux of it.
And I yeah
And,
I
and he's
yeah
called elections. He's called the election for March 31st.
yeah. But I do just want to touch on what you had said about negotiating to cede land. And once again, perhaps I wasn't clear on that, but that was the that was the framing for the tangent I just went on. But I do want to add to that, if that is the case, if and I increasingly believe it's the case. I don't think there's much reason to doubt the media in this case, considering the fact it runs counter to their narrative of the past almost 2 years. Just in terms of looking at this war, what is actually done in terms of the human cost and the cost of lives and livelihood, not only in Ukraine but across the world, I I want you to all take a moment to consider that what the Ukrainian casualty estimates on the higher end are closer to 250,000.
Mm.
That means 250,000 people at least, even just on the Ukrainian side, are dead because Zelensky turned down the same deal that he very well may accept in the coming months. The the April 2022 deal, which was very conciliatory on Russia's part, might I add, was completely scrapped by the Ukrainians. We went over this. I think that story came out over the course of this summer. But that means you've had this man throw away around 250,000 lives on the higher end. And even if it is on the lower end, we're still talking tens, if not over 100,000 lives in this conflict, like I said, on the Ukrainian side alone, to accept the same deal 2 years later. And speaking of complete collapse in state legitimacy and of the credibility of Zelensky, I think that's another point right there, that they were dragged through the hell of this war effort. Once again, whether you agree or not with Ukraine's war goals, it has been a hellish situation on the ground. I don't think anyone can deny that.
Hmm.
Only for it quite literally to all be in vain. At least when the Russians come home, even if it is underwhelming, it's still a victory. You still acquired this territory. You still, depending on how they want to play it, how they want to talk about when they get home, they still liberated their historic land and their co-ethnics. The Ukrainians, they've lost 250,000 men for nothing.
Everything.
Everything.
They
The
they've
country
lost
is
everything.
the country's beyond repair, at least from what it was before the war. Mind you, that Ukraine is one of the few Soviet republics that never reached the level of development it had in the 1980s. I mean, you have countries like Russia, the Baltic states, Belarus more or less stagnated where it was. Same with the Central Asian states, but particularly Russia and the Baltic states were able to exceed the standard of living they had in the 1980s towards the end of the Soviet Union. Ukraine is the one nation that actually decreased in standard of living since then. Now, that's talking from 1991 to present, because of course there was a very low point for Russia I'm sure you all know, in the 1990s, but there was also a very substantial recovery. Point being is, we're talking about the least successful former Soviet republic, and it already was facing a massive emigration crisis from 91 onward. I think because I think in New Year's 1992, it had just shy of 50 million people. And then over the course of that, I think it was down to 40 some million by the time of the Maidan. The Maidan after that saw about a million people emigrate a year, either east or west. And then millions upon millions flooded out, of course. Since the start of the war, might I add, about 2.3 million of those went to Russia proper. Just to keep that in mind. But
Mhm.
we're talking about the slow death of a nation that isn't even 50 years old. And most of that being just in the past uh, almost 2 years. And I mean, forget the legitimacy of Zelensky or the current Ukrainian state, but the Ukrainian national project itself. What beyond a few far-reaching areas in Galicia, which I guess maybe Poland could quote unquote uh, administer, because that idea was bandied about for a few months there. Who knows? They could revive that one. I I know a lot of people towards the beginning of this war, even on the pro-Russia side, who were a bit more pessimistic about the Russian efforts. Were we've solidified Ukrainian national identity, we've solidified the Ukrainian ethnogenesis. Well, I think if there is a suing for peace that does see even the ceding of territory that maybe isn't as much as Russia wants, maybe it does look even a bit underwhelming on the Russian side. It's, in my opinion, I may be speaking drastically, it's the death of Ukrainian nationalism, Ukrainian nationhood as a viable project for the foreseeable future. And I don't really know what other way to put it.
Right. I mean, this is a country that's going to need to be propped up for decades, just to have some kind of recovery. If we don't have an escalation, if we don't have like a wider war that emerges there. Um, it's ironic that before this war started, I said that it would be good if Russia could find a way to make Ukraine a black hole of money and finance and just an economic black hole for America and Europe. And in a way, that's happened. Um, some people argue America could support a dozen Ukraines.
But at what
Like,
cost?
okay, yes, at what cost? Yeah, maybe they have enough money for that, but obviously the Americans and the Europeans, they've now have had almost 2 years. Let's say they didn't provoke this war. Let's say they never foresaw this war, which is odd because beginning in December and November of 2021, they were saying there was going to be a war, right? So what have they done in 2 years? Have they increased their industrial capacity to supply Ukraine with what it needs? I mean, after the first 6, 7 months, it was obvious that everything was going to go artillery, right? What have they done about that? And now, you have other NBC articles about how um, North Korea has not just provided 1 million shells; it is providing missiles, right? So it's much worse. Uh, so why haven't they invested in that? I think because their strategy, they were so cocksure of themselves that Russia would be handed a strategic defeat. They love saying that word, and that would be that a regime change process from the strategic defeat would ensue on its own, right? There would be an economic devastation because of the isolation and so on and so forth, and there would that would also um, be echoed, as it were, by a military catastrophe in Ukraine, and the Russians would have to sue for peace. They would have to return everything, and that's what was supposed to happen. And that didn't happen. I know we repeat it on the show all the time, but it's it still boggles my mind that they didn't they didn't have another strategy besides this. And it has to be said, and I think, the war in Gaza has really demonstrated just how well Putin played this. If he did, I mean, we can get into the Gaza thing inevitably, but even people I know that are extremely pro-Israel fully understand the absolute optics shit show that Israel is in because of their bombing of Gaza. There's just, you know, there were 2 or 3 Hamas fighters in that hospital, so we dropped these bombs on it and killed 200 people, or in this refugee camp. So, you know, we dropped more bombs, and then the next day we dropped more bombs on the same refugee um, area, right? Uh, and the stories, especially in the first 2 weeks, where they're telling people to move to the south, and then they bombed the south where they were going. People literally en route getting bombed. So imagine if, like, Putin had listened to people who said, drop every fab bomb you have on Kiev, and like just bomb them into submission. Now, you and I, when this war just started, so, like, we were firm about that. We said that can't happen. There's no way that can
Well,
happen
I'm pretty sure I
because,
said it at the beginning of the war, and I certainly said it a week or
yeah.
two ago. That would have been World War III. Do you think that if if the West, if NATO saw the extent that Russia was willing to take in Ukraine, had they taken an Israeli approach, they would have
Hmm.
realized this is total war and that we can either intervene to bail out Ukraine and confront Russia once and for all, or we can wait for Russia to steamroll across, confirming all of our propaganda about this mighty Russian machine, but we're not going to do anything about it because that's the position they put themselves in. Had Russia waged a brutal campaign like that, then it would have confirmed all of the saber rattling fear mongering they had about Russia for the past, let's just say, decade, just for the sake of convenience.
Yeah.
In which case, NATO would have had to act to preserve its own legitimacy as an organization, as a defensive organization, because I guarantee you, once, even if just, let's just say, a quarter of what happened in Gaza happened in Ukraine, you would have Poland crying for war, the Baltic states, Romania, Czech Republic. Once again, you know the cadre of countries
Hmm.
I'm referring
Hmm.
to.
Hmm.
They would, if not cried for war, I think they probably would have formed their own coalition at that point and dragged the rest of the West with them because at that point, in order to preserve your legitimacy and because of these nations and the reaction that they were bound to have. I mean, look how severe of a reaction nations like Poland and the Baltic states had just with the current campaign. Imagine
Yeah.
what it would have
And the
been.
only reason,
Yeah, go ahead.
yes, that's right. And the only reason Israel can get away with this is because it's Israel. Russia could not get away with this. But let's say, I mean, I can even imagine the play-by-play, right? How it would go down, like the point where World War III would happen. There would be an intermediary period where I think the Western powers in America would have guessed correctly that if Putin had started bombing and killing civilians the way Israel has done to the Gazans, right? Um, they would have predicted that Russian society would have reacted against him. And that would have caused a snowball effect. Not to mention, of course, let's say countries like India, they 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 would have had no choice. They would not have sided. China would probably also have abandoned them. Like, I would say, even maybe Iran would have stuck by, but Turkey would probably not have played this fence sitter role that it normally does. Um, I think they would have. I think we would have seen, utter mayhem in Russia if they saw, because they would have killed so many people that have relatives in Moscow.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
just to put into perspective, right? So Lloyd Austin was at a hearing not at a court, but it was either with Congress, a committee from Congress or the Senate. And the congressman or the senator, I forget which one he was, mentions that the amount of children that have been killed in Gaza in the first 3 weeks is 6 times higher than the entirety of the war in Ukraine. Right? Like, if that's what Russia had done in the first 3 weeks, I think it would have been all over. It
Oh,
would it,
absolutely. And just to
yeah.
bolster your point there, before the war broke out, one of my biggest arguments about why I didn't think it was going to break out is because there was too much uh, interconnection between the Russian and Ukrainian populations. That there's too much interrelation that you're not going to force cousins to fight each other. And I was clearly wrong on that point, but especially when you frame this, and I'm referring to the Russians, and if they would have framed this as a war of liberation of their co-ethnics in their territory, yet enacted those tactics on it, it would have completely undermined their own narrative. They couldn't have. And look, love or hate the Russians, I actually do take them at face value that this is a war of liberation of their co-ethnics. That they do generally believe that
Hmm.
what they're doing right here is these people are Russian. They're just as Russian as somebody living in Moscow, St. Petersburg, wherever. That they are under a foreign hostile regime. Therefore, we are obligated to act to defend them, to reintegrate this land, and to bring these people back into the fold of the Russian state. Which case, like I said, maybe they did it for cynical reasons. You can discuss the motivations and the internal politics of the Kremlin all you want, but I do think it does fundamentally come down to the fact that the Russian state indeed was protecting the interest of its co-ethnics abroad, particularly in Ukraine, and
Hmm.
you can't wage, let's just be honest, a war of complete conquest, and some would even go as far to say, in which case I probably would, extermination like we've seen in Gaza, if that is your stated goal. It doesn't work like that. And getting back to the initial point that the slow burn strategy, while it did cost Russia some credibility in the short term, has so far paid off. That
Hmm.
taking this slow has, look, I'm not going to downplay the fact that Russia has lost tens of thousands of men in this war, but they have lost a lot less than they would have had they gone all out. They've maintained amicable relations with pretty much every country outside of the Western world, very economically and strategically significant countries, say India, China, Saudi Arabia. Love or hate these places, you can't deny the economic and strategic value that these countries have, and they're now increasingly sympathetic to Russia. Even if they aren't necessarily pro-Russia, depending on how you want to define that term, they're still willing to conduct trade and diplomacy with them, unlike most, in fact, all Western countries at this point. But it really be it, excuse me. The display of patience about this is the words I'm looking for,
Hmm.
has paid off immensely. And say what you will about Putin, I know there's a lot of criticism even from people who do think the war effort was a good idea, do think it was necessary, that he still does have a lot of critics from the right that don't go off and join Ukrainian battalions and assault their own people and shell cars with pensioners in them, unlike certain people. But I would say, despite all of that, the man has proven and a very intelligent leader in many aspects, and whatever else you can say about him is that him and his people inside the Kremlin, so far, now maybe this could all go to hell tomorrow, who knows, but just judging by the current trajectory, have played this extraordinary well despite taking a few blows along the way.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I also said early on that you know, Putin is going to try to demonstrate as much as possible, let's say, to the outside world, that he's as chivalric as can be in a modern theater of war. So that means, avoiding striking civilian centers as much as possible. Um, Remember early on where he didn't want the tanks driving over the farmers' fields, like insane stuff that cost them so many men and material, right? But it like that demonstrating this chivalric attitude at the beginning was, I think, really important in order to convey the message that they wanted a negotiation, a settlement
And
early on.
I have brought up this
Uh,
point before, but considering the population, especially of the territories that Russia has reintegrated into the Russian Federation, that we're talking these parts of eastern and even stretching in some parts of central Ukraine, these are the fickle populations that I've brought up a few times. The ones who will be Ukrainian when convenient, with the ones who will identify with Russian when it's convenient. In which case, a lot of the war was having to appeal to them, making them see that being Russian is the more convenient, the more expedient option. And if you're just blazing your way through that land, if you're waging a campaign of total destruction, you're not going to convince that population to see themselves as Russian or to be content with Russian occupation. You're going to drive them in the complete opposite direction. So a
mhm,
lot of the war, and I think a lot of the way the war was conducted, was in many ways, for lack of a better term, a hearts and minds campaign for that group of people, for the people in the Donbass, for the people in Zaporozhye, for the people in Kherson, even Kharkov, despite the retreats. But once again, in the area that has been disputed since before the beginning of this war, it was in many ways, on top of an actual military campaign, a political, cultural, and social campaign to also win over these people, convince them that being part of Russia is the superior option.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think a lot of people didn't believe it, and of course, a lot of people, because of their identity as Ukrainians, didn't want to believe that Russia was the better option. But of course, there was always a hardcore, and as we found out, mostly in the east and in the parts of the south, that always identified with being Russian, and here we have it. You know.
And I mean, I think it, and we'll see the consequences of this long term, but with the way that Russia has expedited citizenship for actually any Ukrainian, and that doesn't matter where they're from in the country, to become part of Russia, even in the middle of the war. In fact, that was about a month ago they announced that program. It does show that at least the Russian government has confidence that, especially as the war does seem to draw to a close and as wounds are as healed as they can be, that a lot of Ukrainians will start to see Russia as a superior option, especially considering the fact that it just has proven itself in the theater of war. Now, you could also make the argument, and I would, of course, I don't have access to the internals of the Russian government. This does seem like a free ticket for saboteurs or any sort of subversive actor to get into Russia, which may prove to be a problem later down the road. We will see about that. But point being is, since 2014, that's what this has been about. It has been about convincing these people who are on the fence, who will go either way, who have gone either way, whose fathers saw themselves as Ukrainian and grandfathers saw themselves as Russian. And once again, we can go on for generations with that. And that's not even just including those two groups, just all the groups that have occupied this area over the course of the past 3-4 centuries. Getting the history of that region, once again, I'm not going to get too far in the weeds on that. But Russian policy in Ukraine post Maidan was about winning these people over. And although it did take a full scale war in order to reintegrate much of this territory, I do think that they've succeeded in winning at least enough people over to have made this worthwhile. I mean, even people who at the beginning of the war had Russians bombs dropping on them were passive at worst to Russians entering into their town, into their village.
Hmm.
And you do have to wonder, had the Ukrainian armed forces not undergone the stringent restructuring over the past 8 years that it did after the Maidan, how much quicker this war would have been over. But getting to the ultimate point of this is that looking at Zelensky, looking at his political career, looking at this entire war effort, even the most ardent, rabidly pro-Ukraine uh, supporter, whether that be actually an ethnic Ukrainian in Ukraine or somebody in the West, has to look at this and has to realize this man has betrayed everything for nothing. This man has given up everything and also at the same time lost everything, delivered on none of his promises to anyone. And what other legacy is there for this man? And
Yeah.
I'll just say, on top of everything we had just laid out, I will cite that as my case as to why Ukrainian nationhood, Ukrainian nationalism, as a viable idea, is completely dead for this foreseeable future.
Yeah, it has to be completely fostered by the U.S. And in many ways, it's kind of like Israel. Without America, Israel really cannot exist. It just can't. I mean, we saw how after 1 week of this conflict in Gaza, how uh, you know the Americans immediately came up with 10 billion in aid, and now they've just approved 14.3 billion in aid, which ironically put together matches the 24.1 billion that they were asking for Ukraine. So um, you know, they're not the only countries. Of course, little nations have always had to go through these kinds of ordeals. So it's not like I don't understand and I have no empathy or anything like that. But yeah, um, the,
They bet on the wrong
this all could
horse.
have been
That's
this all could have been averted, right? And Zelensky didn't go for it. I mean, he probably would have been a dead man if he did. Uh, I'm very sure some West Ukrainian nationalists would have killed him, and probably would have had the blessings of the U.S. government
oh,
if he
absolutely.
dared sign the peace agreement.
I mean, my opinion of
But
Zelensky since this war started, and actually even a little bit before, is clearly he was a man who was groomed for the office, who I think really had no idea or no business being there. I mean, just given his background as a comedian, as an entertainer. So just took the word of whoever was whispering into his ear at the time because he was a man who was, and in my opinion still is, way in over his head. Now I'm not going to say that he's completely innocent, that he's done nothing wrong, I mean he's been a willing participant in all of
no,
this. But let's just be honest, it's not like this man is the creator of his own schemes. He's just a participant that's led along by whoever is giving him marching orders at that time. Because, like I said, uh, I don't think he's a very politically knowledgeable man, and I don't think he's a very intelligent man, just in the general sense of the word.
hmm yeah, like you say, he was groomed for the position. I think I don't know if he understood what that position, the change in that position, what it would be. I wonder about when he understood that was the case, right? I wonder if he even understood fully in the first 6 months of the war, or let's say in the first month or two of the war, what would be expected of him. Because, as you say, I don't think he really has that. Like in some ways, he is a political animal. Like notice he gets rid of his competition very quickly. Um, he locks up Kolomoisky, essentially his godfather, if you will, right? He's the one that, without Kolomoisky, he never would have become president. He gives them the exposure. They have the long running relationship anyways in the entertainment business with him, and he's a made man because of Kolomoisky, and then he locks up Kolomoisky on trumped up charges, or on charges maybe they were valid, but nobody enforced them until it was convenient to do so. Um, and he brings up charges to Zaluzhny back in early October. Now the one interesting thing, of course, is he's agreed to elections. That tells me that maybe his winning days are over, because he would not want an election. If he goes for an election, it's because he knows it's over. It's completely over. And the possibility of Ukrainian troops marching on Kiev, right, to go against his faction, because by now he has a faction, right? But how loyal would that faction be if Zaluzhny's troops with Sirsky decided to, march to Kiev? So if he's called an election, he's basically considered that scenario, the possibility of that scenario um, happening, and he decides, okay, if they
It's
if they
also a
don't
way he
want
can
me,
get out with his head attached to his neck.
yes,
Because I think he's
absolutely,
accepted that his time is over, but this is an easy way of going. This is a
yes,
way where he can move to New York or Miami and start his NGO, because that's the fate of all these people. And
yeah,
I
he's
think,
got 4 to 5 months,
oh,
and then that's
absolutely.
it.
I mean, I'm still banking on him going to Tel Aviv and displacing Netanyahu and becoming Prime Minister of Israel, just to just to continue the act. I mean, look, he's got the experience. What more could the Israeli population want? They have an internationally recognizable face. They have somebody who isn't mired in as much scandal as Netanyahu. Very low bar, I know. And they have somebody who has experience embezzling wartime funds for his own benefit. What more could
Mhm.
Israel want? And I'm still banking on he needs to go to Tel Aviv. He needs to meet with Netanyahu. He needs to redeem his citizenship because he is eligible for the right of return, as we all know. And there
Mhm.
needs to be a special session of the Knesset, and they need to unanimously elect him prime minister because that is the only way forward.
Indeed.
I mean, I full disclosure, I am joking, but dumber things have happened. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And this is a crazy war, anyways, in many respects. And I mean, it's just look at the Biden administration. I mean, people thought the Trump administration was kooky and weird. I mean, just look at the Biden administration. It just is. It's just as insane and weird. Even more, far more. Um, it just has a name that makes a lot of people believe that. They're the good guys, they're the adults in the room. So you have all these insane contradictions. Oh no, Trump got elected. We're going to have a world war. Like, well, why? Why would we have a world war? And here they are, the same people, on 2 occasions in the last 2 years, and the potential for a global conflict, and that they say nothing. But
They dive
I
headfirst into it.
suppose what's that?
They dive headfirst into it. They don't just say nothing. They are
Yeah.
enthusiastically on board.
They really know that friend enemy distinction. They really, really know it. They really know how to use the rhetoric, even, no matter how contradictory they sound. Um, they completely understand the friend enemy distinction, and they never let go of it. They never apologize afterwards. They never accept that they contradict themselves and so on. But I suppose did you want to move to the conflict in Gaza?
I think we've exhausted everything we can say about Ukraine at this point, and who knows, the Minutia
Yeah.
Minute might be coming to an end. Imagine a war report without the Minutia Minute. I can't remember the days before then. But I suppose Gaza is the net. Oh wait, there's one last thing I wanted to mention tangentially related to
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine, and
Mm-hmm.
that is Volvan and Lexus have struck again.
Oh yeah.
So they prank called Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy, and they got her to concede that Europe is growing exhausted with the war on Europe. Now, mind you, that Maloney came in with this whole chest thumping. We're going to support Ukraine because fighting Russia is the same as fighting China, and we're going to be this bastion of Western civilization and liberal. Okay, maybe not so much quote unquote liberal values, but Western values and traditional values. Like I'm a based far right nationalist. Please like me. And then probably the more damning of the two confessions they got out of her was, oh, mass migration is just impossible to stop. It's just there's nothing we can do about it. It's just we're
Yes,
so
that's
dependent on
right.
the migrant. Now, mind you, look, I'm not saying we've had a functional Italian government since the formation of the Italian state in 1861. I actually will go that far, but you know what? The Frankenstein coalition government they had with Conte and Salvini, at least they were able to put something of a stop in migration. I will give them credit insofar as that is concerned. But just that, look, I think we all know these things, that we all can assume these things about not just Maloney, but pretty much every Western leader. But just to have audio evidence of it is all the richer. And that's the last thing I want to mention
Hmm.
tangentially related to Ukraine. But I see that you have sent some Gaza
Yeah,
maps.
so some Gaza maps. So this gives you an idea. The first one, I mean, the second one is Syriac maps. That might be a little bit older, but a lot of the mapping that Weeb Union does, and the first map, the top map of Gaza, that is Weeb Union, and he does rely heavily on Syriac maps. Syriac maps has been going on since 2017, and apparently he might be shutting it down. He's saying he's overworked. There's another job that he has. He didn't think that this would go on for much longer, and so on and so on. But yeah, so if you want to use the first one, maybe use the second one as a kind of a close up, even if
Yeah,
the
I got them set
territories.
up where you can see both of them.
Okay, yeah. So this conflict is really something else that is shaping up in Gaza. I think the difficulties now are just beginning to emerge. I don't know. I guess most of our listeners and viewers have seen the videos in the last 72 hours of the Gazans and their fighting techniques right now. They're incredible. Um, so even before Friday, 25 Merkava tanks were destroyed, and more than that in infantry fighting vehicles. But I think from Friday onwards, maybe it was even Thursday, you saw these videos of the Gazan fighters, the Hamas fighters, climbing out of tunnels in areas that are olive groves and bushes. And one of them has an RPG ordnance that he's running, holding in his hands. He's already seen an armored vehicle and a tank like pass by, and he runs to the tank. He lays the ordnance on the tank. It has a self detonation on a timer. It blows up. Then he returns back to the area close to where the hole was. Another fighter is there, and they both begin launching RPGs against the tank, and I'm going to presume also against the armored vehicle. Then the next day, uh, 9 different armored vehicles are hit. One of them happens to be one of these bulldozers, except the guy just lit it on fire, but I don't know how effective that was, to be perfectly honest. But it was brazen. He's like, he's running up on this thing, and you're wondering, where is the infantry, right? There's no infantry support. Now, there's 2 reasons why there wouldn't be infantry support. They think this area is secure and they don't need it, or they're afraid that this area is not secure and they could be killed or sniped. So the count for Israeli soldiers is over 345 now. It's the largest toll in many years. And we've talked on the show about, and others have talked about it as well, other shows about Israel is very averse to huge losses for its military. But what we're seeing with these Gazans is that they're quite willing to run right up next to these vehicles with RPGs. Now, these particular RPGs that are being used are a type from the Soviet era, and there was speculation. By the way, Renaissance Horizon brought this up. Very good channel. I've been following him probably for like 3 or 4 years.
The most autistic, in-depth, and I mean that in a complimentary way. If
Yeah,
him or any of his fans ever hear this, the most
he's very
the
thorough.
most autistic, in-depth analysis of European politics I've heard from anyone.
Absolutely, absolutely. He knows these politics better than I think a lot of Europeans, and
Oh,
he's an
yeah,
American.
that's the joke that people always make as a comment. Like, I'm from X country, and you know the political situation better than I do. Like,
Hmm.
go down to
Hmm.
his comments on any European election video, and there'll be like at least three or four of those just immediately.
Yeah. So as he explained, these RPG systems, and you see them in Ukraine all the time. Ukrainians and Russians use them, but you saw them in the Syria conflict. Both sides, the moderate beheaders as well as the Syrian army, both use them. They're very common, right? But the warhead that's used on them, right? These particular ones is a type that was developed in the later part of the Soviet Union that was used to break through some of the most heavily armored tanks and as well as infantry fighting vehicles. And there was speculation that there were still huge stores of these in Libya. Well, as it turns out, and he gave a link to the video, um, the Gazans are actually creating these themselves in their underground bunkers. And if I'm not mistaken, do they not have something like 7,000 tunnels? It's like really elaborate. There's some areas that are like, I don't know, like 60, 70 meters deep. Like you're not going to blow them up, right? If they have ways of sustaining themselves, I don't know. But I mean, I don't know how they would do it. But anyways, all to say that the defense that the Gazans have devised here, um, and it has to be based on wit because they don't have the technology. There are Reaper drones that have been flying from the Americans surveying this area. There was also a story, I believe, on Thursday. 11 IDF soldiers were killed. They were in one of these, I believe, what do they call them? Nehar? It's an
I
infantry
think
fighting
so.
vehicle. Am I, if I got that right? Is it Nehar?
Pretty sure.
Something like that. Now, it is huge. It is, to me, it's bigger than a Bradley. It is very thickly armored. It kind of looks like a Merkava tank without the turret, if I had to compare it to anything, right? There was a video on the first day of when the fighting began on October the 7th, where three of these guys had locked themselves into one of these Nehar infantry fighting vehicles, and a separate detachment came to rescue them. And they opened the door anyways. They got out. There was fighting, gunfight going on, and but it's just to show you like it, it it's very well armored. Well, in these videos, they they have been neutralized, and so they had a photo circulating of these 11 guys. So I imagine it's quite large, and it has a cabin that can fit that many. I would assume For such a vehicle, the crew would have to be at least two, but I'm going to guess there's like three. And that probably leaves room for, eight in a squad to leave the vehicle and fight. So, yeah, 11 in one instance. That isn't to say Hamas isn't suffering. Hezbollah is also suffering in the north. And towns in the north of Israel have been evacuated. Something like 40,000 people have left. There was even a program I saw uh, of a resident who said that she's never going to feel safe until she leaves Israel, and so on.
Yeah,
But
I did
I
see that
just
too.
wanted to bring that up,
And
that the tunnels are very extensive. These guys are popping up from behind enemy lines, and as I say, they either feel really safe, that's why there's no infantry support, or they're afraid to get out of their vehicles. Now, from what I've seen, I have seen them with infantry support, but it's hard to gauge where and when this is happening to answer that question, right? But Israel is kind of hesitant to admit the losses. Both sides exaggerate the losses of the opponent and minimize their own losses. I mean, this is like a rule of war to keep morale of the soldiers. But I would say the losses for the Israelis are higher than I thought. And really, like you can see the areas that they've taken, those are areas that were less populated, especially along the beach. That part that cuts through the kind of the middle of the Gaza Strip. It's not like a beach. It's definitely more built up. It's more urban, but it's not as urban as Gaza City. I think Gaza City is of all the little cities there, it is the most dense. So it's going to be very interesting what happens, and I think all those early statements by Netanyahu and some of his military chiefs, that this is going to be a long war, is probably true.
you do see already the popular tide turning against Netanyahu once again because he has kicked the can down the road now. Perhaps you can say jumping into a war head first probably is not the wise decision, in which case I would agree in a vacuum. But when he had the outrage, when he had the post attack support, similar to say what maybe like George Bush had after 9/11, where he had a blank check to do everything he wanted, he whittled that away. In which case, even now, just about a month out, the popular sentiment is starting to turn against him again. And now that people are starting to be able to see clear, they are laying the crisis at his feet, in which case I think that certainly the majority of the blame does go on Netanyahu and his administration. And in which case, you do have calls for him to step down from power after the war's end, because there is a large contingent of the population that does not like Netanyahu, but also realize the challenges of changing a cabinet during wartime, so they're willing to tolerate him for the time being until this war can be resolved. But ultimately, even if this is some sort, even if it was some sort of coordinated effort, even if it was a purpose, quote unquote, intelligent failure, it has completely backfired on Netanyahu, and the man's career is completely destroyed. Unless he can somehow pull off a miraculous victory with the complete annexation of Gaza with minimal Israeli casualties, then his career is completely over, and it's likely if he doesn't escape the country, he will spend the rest of his life in a cell. Now, once again, maybe he'll have his own NGO, think tank, lobbying organization waiting for him in New York, Washington, or Miami, or LA, or the usual destinations. Now, of course,
Mhm.
mind you, he already does have a U.S. passport. He actually attended high school in the United States. Actually, I think he was can't remember. He was either born or raised in Pennsylvania. So he's also,
Mm.
I believe, because I think it was his father is a U.S. citizen. He also is technically eligible to run for president of the United States. So who knows? We could get Prime Minister Zelensky of Israel and President Netanyahu of the United States. Yeah, I'm sure Trump would immediately acquiesce the nomination. Probably the only person Trump would immediately acquiesce the nomination to. And even that's a bit of a stretch. Sometimes Trump and Netanyahu do not get along. But moving beyond the outlandish statements here, Netanyahu's career is finished. I don't think that's a new or insightful take. I think pretty much anyone who's been following the situation in Israel before the war, at least marginally, would understand the no-win situation that he is in. And while I do think that largely the Palestinian cause has been probably stamped out by this, because I do think that Israel is going to seek a permanent solution to this question. Now, barring some sort of multinational coalition that puts an end to Israel, I know that some analysts like Scott Ritter and even McGregor are a bit more overzealous about this kind of thing, where they say
Yeah,
that
yeah.
we could see Syria retake the Golan Heights. I think a lot more would have to happen before we worked ourselves into to a position like that, but I don't think it's unfair to say that Israel is in probably one of the weakest positions it's ever been in. They've spurned decades of progress with both Egypt and Jordan. The Camp David Accords might as well be in the trash can at this point. Not entirely, but might as well be. And you have the Iranians have been measured because, as they have said, as even Hezbollah said, when if you got anything out of Nasrallah's speech, which was very vague and I think intentionally so, that
Hmm.
more or less time is on their side and they just have to wait this out because Israel is on the rocks, and especially with the declining West, that they're not going to be able to bail Israel out forever. And you even have this dynamic going on between Biden and Netanyahu right now. I don't believe for a second that Biden's quote unquote measured approach is because of some great outpouring of concern about the Palestinians or the human cost. It's that he realizes that if Israel gets itself embroiled in a conflict of this caliber, that the United States is not in a position to bail out Israel. And I mean, they'll do everything they can for him, but just given American military readiness, American economic power, and just the situation of America on the world stage and even domestically in general, they're not in a position to bail out Israel right now to the extent that they would need it. So that's why you have Biden urging restraint. Don't make the same mistakes we made after 9/11. Don't let hatred and rage guide you. Blah blah blah. A lot of the things that also play very well for him being the reasonable centrist, the humanitarian of it all, trying to win back some degree of the further left to also despise Israel as this settler colonial project. And don't worry, I have plenty to say about the left continuing to be devoured by the monsters it has created, because it's been one of the most rich things to watch, especially with how much public opinion on the left has turned against Israel, and how left wing Zionism is as dead as Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian nationhood. It's been rich to watch, but I'll get into that a little after we get out of some of the more substantial content. But Israel is, I don't think there's really many ways to overstate this, but it's in a no-win position. Saudi Arabia has already axed normalization ties completely, and then I believe it was their minister of culture of all people who made the flippant comment about dropping an atomic bomb on Gaza. In which case, that's that's real great for the strategy of nuclear ambiguity that Israel has touted itself on for decades at this point, coming out right and saying that you have the Saudis issue a letter of condemnation about that one particular minister, saying that, well, we can't tolerate that sort of rhetoric, especially in a country that we're supposed to be in normalization ties with. I mean, if you had any illusion that the Abraham Accord was somehow still on the table out of all of this, which I mean, look, the Abraham Accords were tenuous at best. At the moment we had Chinese-led détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, they were as good as dead because that was the entire premise of the Abraham Accords, aligning the Gulf states and Israel against Iran. And when the Gulf states are shaking hands and sitting down with the Iranians, normalization with Israel becomes much less of a concern. That's not to say they wouldn't pursue it entirely. I think after this current crisis, that deal is completely off the table. But for and they, one thing that's always just floored me about Israel, and I think that the past month has probably exemplified this more than anything I can think of. For a nation that cries about how few friends it has and how neglected it is by the world, they have a way of berating, browbeating, and taking full advantage of every friend that they have and their supposedly few friends, that they just completely abuse them, completely rake them over the coals, take them for everything they're worth, and then cry that you're not doing more. Have never seen a more entitled nation in my life. And once again, we're
Mhm.
talking about a country that will decry that so many other countries hate it, but whenever a country doesn't hate it, it's give me more. Worse, I mean, I
Yeah,
think it
yeah,
was
yeah.
when Zelensky gave his speech back at the beginning of this year where I said it was Netanyahu levels of petulance and begging on his part. And lo and behold, Israel couldn't be outdone in anyone when it came to chiding U.S. Congress for not supporting them enough and acting entitled to the entire U.S. Treasury. Of course, there has to be a crisis that breaks out in the Middle East that involves Israel in particular that demands that. But once again, I'm not spelling the end of the Israeli state. I'm not saying that's off the table either, but I'm not going to say that as a certainty. But it's a no-win situation for them. It is, I would say, almost as dire, if not as dire, as the situation in Ukraine. There is no way out, in which case they will come out with any sort of benefit. And maybe depending on the political pressures in Washington, the direction of the State Department, the new crop of elites that's coming in from the younger generation, but some sort of concession, some sort of negotiation. I'm not even talking two-state solution. So long as the Zionist lobby has the sort of stranglehold it has now, which it probably will, I would say for the next 20 to 30 years, just to throw a random number out there, just a gut feeling, then the idea of any sort of quote unquote two-state solution that involves the United States is completely off the table. Now, the rest of the world, that may be the case. They may strong arm the Israelis into giving over more sovereignty to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank or finding some sort of solution in Gaza. But as for the time being, is Israel is so determined to run the population out of Gaza because it's their last opportunity to solve this on their terms and their terms alone. Because other than that, it's coming to the point where beyond the blank checks they get from America, they've burned the rest of the goodwill that they have with any of the strategically important world. Even Russia and China, which kept on decent terms for decades, have finally started to run out of patience with them. Certainly, other Middle Eastern partners are out of the question. As I'd mentioned before, we have Egypt and Jordan, which it made great strides to try to pacify those situations. I'm not saying they're on the brink of war or anything, but I would say the Jordanians more so have had a harsher reaction than the Egyptians. They've burned decades of goodwill on that part as well. And you have the unresolved situation in both Lebanon and Syria, despite the fact that Hezbollah has not decided to act at this point. They still are a they still are a latent threat that could be activated at really any moment. It's a very volatile situation, but Yanan, the clean break memo, all of that, all the stuff you've heard about, has been once again echoing the situation in Ukraine has been all for nothing because they have undone, and even worse in the case in Ukraine, they've not undone literal decades of progress that they made to secure their own state. Look, love or hate Israel, you can't deny that they have played their hands well. They've played their hand well in the
Mhm.
past several decades since 1948. But ever since the hardliners in Likud got in power, they've completely forgotten how to do that. Much like the case of the American Empire, they've forgotten how to negotiate. They've forgotten how to give up little in the short term to gain a lot in the long term, where it's everything and it's now, and have completely forsaken any virtues of patience. Now, perhaps this was always just destined to happen to a Jewish state in the Middle East. Perhaps we could look at. I believe the figures, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong or give more context to this, that I believe in the Old Testament there's no Israelite kingdom that lasted more than 78 years, or maybe I have
Or
that number
80
wrong.
or something like
It's
that.
it's somewhere in that range, and I mean, look how long Israel has been in place. I mean, if you want to take that as a one for one, in which case maybe not necessarily, because I think what a lot of people, and I'll get into this when I talk more about the Christian Zionists and um, the more hardline Jewish sects. Um, but you can't you have to look at the Old Testament in the context of which it was written, the fact that it is more of a record, a historical document than um, any sort of. I mean, I'm not saying it isn't a holy text, but it's just speaking purely from a Christian perspective. It's not like the New Testament where it is this set of universal and eternal principles. It is a historical context of how we got from point A to point B, in which case Christian Zionists and the hardline factions of Judaism do not understand, perhaps even willfully so, but I digress.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's important to reiterate that. I, th- I think I think a lot of our listeners understand that, and also that the land is theirs, like as long as you're able to be faithful to God, right? That's why they went away in bondage, was for their lack of. And also remember that Christ said, "I will leave you with neither root nor branch. Your house will be left to you desolate." Right? The prophecies about in one day the kingdom, the temple, and the priesthood, and the line of kings will all go away. The early church fathers mentioned this. This was also one of the big reasons why many Jews converted in that area, right? We understand about a third of them converted, right? And then you have very interesting genetic studies, right? Because a lot of these Zionists will say, those Palestinians, they're not like they're Arabs, as if there was nobody there, right? That's hilarious. It's like you're like, oh, you're between 40 to 60% European content, and you're telling them that they're recent arrivals.
Yeah, and then your
Uh,
Mizrahi cousins that you want to talk about Arabs. Like,
yeah,
come
yeah,
on.
yeah. So again, Baron of the Taiga had a very interesting thread about this, and so it turns out that roughly, well, first of all, everybody in this area has genetically changed. I remember reading about because I've always been fascinated by the Arctic and so on. I remember reading about that whole region of Beringia, Chukchi, Siberia, all the way to Alaska, and the migrations that happened in that area and so on. And I was reading about Lake Baikal and the people that lived there, I don't know, 5,000 years ago migrated into this area. But the people who live in Baikal, and I mean the Asiatic peoples, I don't mean the European, Caucasian, Slavic Russians who have also moved in there. These two separate Asian people aren't, they're distantly related. They're not the same people. Now, it should be said that the DNA that we have from the Old Testament era, okay, so this would probably go back to when the Seleucids, when the Greeks controlled, uh, the Holy Land, okay, just to give you a rough idea, and instead of calling it Palestine or Israel. Um, so if you look at the DNA from like let's say the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth century BC, right? The genetics that are coming, the genetic results are showing that Palestinian Christians are actually the closest living DNA relatives to Old Testament Jews. Okay,
Oh yeah,
so
absolutely. And it
absolutely. Now, I've told you, but I've never told the audience. Many years ago, this would have been probably 2008. So I was hired to photograph a baptism of an Orthodox Palestinian family. I'm not kidding you. The mother literally could have been Jerry Seinfeld's sister. Just a bit more tan, but like literally his sister, right? So they're not, they are definitely from the region, right? Also understand that 5% of the people in Gaza they're Christians. They're either Orthodox or Catholic. Of a population that's roughly around 2.2 million people, that's tens upon tens of thousands, right? So, anyways, um, so there's that argument, right? But you know uh, the there's a chat group that I'm in, and some of the people are, I mean, they're all pro-Israel. They're anti-woke, and they're genuinely anti-woke. They're anti-immigration, anti-COVID. They've always been that way for the 2 years that I've been in this chat. Okay. Um, but I would say when this whole thing happened with Israel, I was like the only guy that was, not on board, but they're very much on board and pro-Israel. And they are panicking right now about immigration. They really believe that America and Canada could be, they could be ruled by Muslims. They honestly believe this. Now, the Muslim population in America is 0.6%. It's not even 1%. Like Jews literally outnumbered them, something like 5 to 1.
and then get into how many of those people are actually practicing religious Muslims and not
Right.
just ethnic Muslims, so to speak, who are. I mean, I think there was a study about a year ago that came out that U.S. Muslims are more in support of gay marriage than the average population of Christians. So
Right. They'll
that should
say
tell you all you
that,
need to
but
know.
I don't know if they actually believe that. They understand their political
Oh,
allegiances. I would say
absolutely.
after this, support for gay marriage is going to pummel. It's going to crumble amongst Muslim Americans. I have zero doubt of that. Right.
Yes,
These are
yes.
all these things are contingent. Right. So, yes. Now, in places like Britain, France, Germany, but particularly, let's say, France and Germany to a lesser extent, big Muslim populations, right? Okay, I could see something like that, but there's not going to be a caliphate. Like
Yeah.
I just don't believe that. There, now I was talking to one of these fellas, okay, and I talked about that perfect synergy. Israel wants to destroy certain countries in the Middle East, and the timing is good with certain American interests, right? And they destroy them, and then refugees are created, and then Israeli NGOs and European NGOs, and many of those European NGOs are funded by Jewish people, right? And so you have this perfect synergy where they destroy these countries that reduce the threat for Israel, and these people migrate to Europe, and you have people there who want a more diverse population because they think it's great, but also because Jews feel threatened by a very homogenous population, right? Ever since World War II and the events that took place therein. Okay. Right. So I'm talking to him about this, and he says, yeah, but why would they do this? I go, maybe because they're not guided by logic. Maybe they're guided by anger. And then we continue to talk, and he says something that's to be done, something drastic, because if it keeps going on this way, notice how now, like, I have to be fair. These guys never wanted mass migration, and they didn't care who it was. So, like, let me point that out. But there are other people, who you see on Twitter who are liberal. Suddenly, immigration is really important. Suddenly, they sound
Oh, I
like
got a hell
what
of a
the
story about
alt-right
that, but
sounded
go
like
on.
4 years ago. Hmm? Yeah, isn't it rich? But this is the part that I think I got him. I said, first of all, I said, why are you waiting for white people to do something about it? We have no power. The lobbies that took that power away from us, right? Our own population is divided on this issue. Okay, because, well, take a look at Garland, Merrick Garland. He wants the border in the South open because his parents survived the Holocaust. I go, it's constantly invoked, right? That's the context for everything that happens in the West after World War II. I said, we have no power to change this. You know what? Jews need to talk to other Jews to turn the immigration policy around in the West. Only you guys can do it. We can't do it. It's up to you. And I think that just shocked him. He just wasn't prepared for that. I go, don't wait for us to do something. We can't. It's up to you guys. But you see the crux of the matter, right?
Oh,
If
absolutely.
they do, then they become transparent. Then everybody understands. You have this new law in France, a bill that's being proposed, where if you say something that's deemed to be anti-Zionist, not anti-Semitic, because now anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. 2 years, of a 2 years cell term, prison term, which could go up to 5 years, right? Um, Germany is trying to pass a bill to stop any new immigrants. They have to swear allegiance to Israel, just like the laws in the U.S. You have all these states that will not conform to BDS, and they will not boycott Israel, and so on and so on.
Yeah, you can't get state contracts if you don't buy products from the foreign state. So that's it.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah. And then, as you were saying, Olaf Schlaz wants them to take an oath of loyalty to Israel in order to get citizenship. So the civic nationalism, the migration can continue so long as you love Israel enough. You can displace
Yes.
the local German populations. You can do whatever you want. Just don't hate Israel too much. Is really
Yeah.
all it
Yeah. Yeah.
comes down to. And
That's their way of avoiding. Well, it's kind of like a parallel to illegal and legal immigration, right? We're going to control the border. We're going to control immigration by making sure everybody swears allegiance to Israel. Like, get real, right? Anyhow, I think that got him. I think that got him. Only you can change it. It's up to you guys, not us.
yeah, that's
But they're afraid to play that hand because they're very afraid of looking that powerful. It
if only
can't
they
do
could
it.
fellow white their way into immigration restrictions.
Yeah.
But no, no,
And
that
to be fair, some of them were always hesitant about that. They kind of foresaw the situation, right? The ones I know, right?
yeah, the
But you have to talk to your co-ethnics about this. Don't expect me to do it. What, I'm going to convince them? They don't even respect me. What are you talking about?
are you telling me that Yoram Hazoni is going to be the new George Soros? uh,
There was an op-ed that George Soros wrote back in 2007 about Hamas and how there cannot be a negotiated peace unless Hamas is at the bargaining table. It's
really?
hilarious. Oh yeah, he
uh,
he he really is a Palpatine character, isn't he?
George Soros' proposal is Hamas can exist, but it has to fight against Russia. That's the Soros compromise.
I know. I
Hamas can exist,
know.
but it has to fight against Russia. That's
Yeah,
that's
this
that is the ace in the hole that the American empire is looking for. That's the deal
yeah.
they should go into negotiations. Have Oslo Accords 2. That's the deal they should offer, and everyone in the American empire would be ecstatic about that. It that's like three birds, one stone.
Mhm.
No, better yet, all these migrants coming to Europe. Not only do you have to pledge loyalty to Israel, you also have to pledge 18 months service in the AFU before you can get citizenship in Germany or
Well, did
France.
you hear of the story of this Spanish mercenary who left?
Yeah, I sent that to you.
Oh yeah, that's right. You said that to me.
Wouldn't
Yes.
Franco be
Right?
proud the fact that
Yeah.
you had a Spanish nationalist fighting for Israel? I mean, a fun fact if you didn't know, Franco's Spain did not recognize Israel until the not even until the end. It was after Franco was out of power and Spain was liberalized that only then did they recognize Israel. So I'm
Yeah.
sure Generalissimo would be just so proud of that one, his strong soldier. But no, I think that is the proposal. The Algerians 18 months in the AFU and a loyalty pledge to Israel, and you're German. That's all that's needed. It solves so many problems. I should have a DC think tank with this. Actually, I should probably shut up about this before I give them too many ideas.
Mhm.
But yeah, but that is really the direction they're going to take this. Even though I
But
suppose
it is funny. Like you remember that meme when the Floyd riots happened in 2020?
which one.
It was like a well, it was almost like a Babylon B article. They had like this guy on his couch, like and all it said on the top, white nationalists may act are sitting back and doing nothing, and it's tearing the country apart. Something, right? It's and it's kind of funny because you have them now like immigration wasn't so was great and wonderful until like it started to affect them. And now they're all like going crazy. They're terrified. I even saw a ridiculous video of this woman who says hashtag will you hide me. It's just
Even though I do have to add to the mass migration case. You see, in
Mm.
America, it's not going to change anything because all the Hispanics just come here and become like Pentecostals and evangelicals, which,
Yeah, yeah,
in which case
absolutely.
they buy into the Schofield eschatology that. So no that problem is solved beyond like the few of them that like maybe shave half their heads and call themselves Latinx who stand with
Mm.
Palestine out of some sort of solidarity with the oppressed people or whatever. I mean, look, that's maybe not ideal for the regime, but they can tolerate that. Europe is more the problem, but at the end of the day, Europe is
Yeah.
going to follow the marching orders of Washington. So um,
But one of the things
yeah,
I've
go
noticed in
ahead.
the protests, even in North America, right? In Toronto, they haven't been that big, and honestly, like the ones in Toronto, I used to photograph them, but they just have. It's much worse now than it was back in 2003. With the Intifada and also the invasion of Iraq and so on. Is there are even more just disgusting blue hair types, right? And I've not been able to bring myself to photograph to document any of these protests because I've already seen photos of some of them. The one in Montreal was different, though. I saw video footage of that. But I should get to the point. The thing is I've noticed that in a lot of I saw one in Minnesota, New York, I do see a lot of people who are, they're brown. I don't know if they're Central and South American. I don't know if they're Arab. I don't know if they're, I don't know, Pakistani or mixed race. Some of them, there is a sizable black contingent, right? I guess what I'm trying to get at is Israel completely understands. They completely understand that it doesn't matter like how many Arabs there are. Like brown people do not share the guilt for the Holocaust, nor should they be made to, right? And they're not like the support isn't going to be there. I think they're becoming aware of that, right? So I don't know what's going to happen, but support isn't going to be there because right now their biggest contingent is boomer whites, and they're dying off. We know whites 35 and under do not support Israel the way whites did, let's say, a generation ago in the 80s and 90s. It's just not there.
Oh yeah, I mean that's the problem they face with the youth. The non-white ones see this as a solidarity movement against
Yeah,
colonialist white supremacy.
they do.
The white right wing ones see this as have a streak of isolationism to them. We probably haven't seen this country in 100 years, where it's who cares? And look,
Hmm.
a pox in both their houses. Let them fight it out, which is how they feel about Russia, Ukraine, which is how they feel about China, Taiwan. It's just yeah, look, lock ourselves in and let the world burn. In which case, I have to say I'm somewhat sympathetic to that view, being a under 35 white guy. It's like, yeah, let's lock our doors, let's kick everyone out, and let's
It's going to be cozy.
yeah,
Prove me wrong. It's very cozy.
yeah, let's.
Get a hoodie, get a brand new favorite hoodie, especially winter. Get one with extra lining, and just enjoy.
I'm wrapped in my favorite blanket right now. It's very nice. Got the heater out. It's that time of year again, and yeah, you're lucky I'm
The
not
world's
doing the show.
burning and I'm cozy.
I'm like one of those little like Pepe Apu frogs, just wrapped up in his little blanket, staring at his fireplace. I mean, there's more reality in those dumb little memes than you would originally think. And
Hmm.
yeah, that's the position you got to take if you are a right winger of European descent, whether you are on the European continent or in North America, Australia, etc. That's the position you got to take. And I don't know, maybe we'll all meet up in Argentina, because that'll be the only place that isn't irradiated by the time this is all said and done. But uh, hey, that's an option. It's on the table. It's not a bad piece of land down there in Argentina, from what I hear. But I'm getting off on too much of a tangent here. But getting back to your point, yeah, in terms of support for Israel, Israel has also, and you saw this, and they still kind of try to do it. They failed to pivot, because for several years there, it's look at Tel Aviv's gay scene. Look at how tolerant we are. Look, women have rights here. They tried to appeal to that streak of liberalism, but it just fell flat, because they realized that it turns out the left wing in America isn't necessarily about any sort of political or social values. It is just complete racial and ethnic politics. That's really all it comes down to. And we've cast our lot with the wrong side of that. Oh no, maybe the play is just to put a bunch of Mizrahim in front of the cameras, get a Mizrahim prime minister, and say that we're part of your struggle against a white settler colonialism, and just show like
That's inevitable.
just show like the whitest the white Palestinians, say that they're the colonizers. Maybe that's the play here, that the white Levantines are the bad guy, but the swarthy Jewish populations are the oppressed underdog. Maybe that's the winning play for Israel, because I can't think of anything else. I mean, I'm open
Yeah.
to criticisms of that idea, but
You, the other thing too is like the thing I noticed in this group is they're furious with the woke and the woke supporting Palestine, right?
we support BLM. Why can't you support us? Like I've heard those cries so much, or
Yeah,
like,
there's that. There's that. Remember, this is right wing, right? Like they don't care. They hated BLM.
oh, oh yeah,
But
okay, yeah.
I know what you mean. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, because
That's
there's
true.
like the left, like the center left wing of that, who are
Yes.
like really adamant about that point.
Yep. No, it's a good point. It's a very good point. But the other thing, so they're very upset by that. Don't you know if you went to Palestine, they would throw you off one of their. It's like, I mean, yeah, and I don't know, like, um, if you question these people and why do they support them if the not all of them support them, of course, right? But why do you support them if you went there they would mistreat
Well,
you?
I also
Well,
love that
they'll just
argument.
say because human decency. I can't watch, like, they're being sincere about it,
Oh
like.
yeah, but I love that argument. It's like, oh well, Palestine doesn't have pride parades from the people who I would say, and they have more of a point than they don't, who have spent the past 3 years calling the LGBTQ CIA stuff like targeting children, blah blah blah. It's like, look, say what you will at the methods, but like all of a sudden you're defending the moral virtues of that because the Palestinians don't like it. And look, I know the game they're trying to play. They're trying to work them into like a moral, like they're trying to work the quote unquote woke into a moral quandary, even though once again it's not going to work because it never does. And, and they
it
think that,
just it just
yeah,
reminds me of that whole, what's his name, Tommy Robinson. It's so
yeah,
2016, like we've revisited this area all over again.
yeah. It's the really it's like the civic nationalist classical liberal type. Like we need to defend the outpost of Western civilization because Western civilization is when you have technology and a parliamentary government. There's nothing else to it. There's no greater cultural, ethnic, or religious values to that. And yeah, so therefore Israel is part of Western civilization because they have technology and a parliament, which I guess that's the standards nowadays. So hey Brazil, welcome to Western civilization. But I kid, never, not even by the standards of technology. But the Israel once again in every facet has worked itself into a no one position. I do have to wonder if Israel takes some major blows with this, with the contingent of the boomer Christian Zionists, for lack of a better term, that are still alive, when they start to see these things, when they start to see these things that they've been preached to about for 30 or 40 years, when the events happen, but none of the prophecies come to pass because of their complete misinterpretation of them, I mean, that's got to be a blow to the legitimacy of that, I guess you could say, very loosely speaking, sect of Christianity because you have they've been saying this is going to happen. These prophecies that we've interpreted right and nobody else has gotten right in the past 1800 years. It was just us. We were able to come up with it. When all of that inevitably goes up in smoke, how many of these people are going to stay loyal to uh, that sect, that faction of once again what I guess could loosely be called Christianity? Because and that's for the ones who are still alive because once again it is an aged population. It's boomers, it's people in their 60s and 70s who buy into this rhetoric. Even the Christian young people, even if they are still Protestant, a lot of them don't buy into it. Like there's a lot of I guess call it rainbow Protestantism that is uh, fully on board with the Palestinian project because that's the left wing cause. I mean, once again, we're talking about these Episcopalians and these other types that have the progress flag outside their churches. I'm sure I don't need to go into any more detail.
Yeah.
I mean to say what I said once again, the only two acceptable forms of Christianity, as far as the American Empire are concerned, is if you have a rainbow flag or an Israeli flag outside your church. Ideally, they want you to have both. And unfortunately, that ideal there is a small sliver I do think of that exists, but that is quickly dissipating, and really, it's a trap that Israel, along with their own diaspora, have walked themselves into. They've painted themselves into a corner, and there's really no way out, I guess, besides the Samson option.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think the world has settled in for a long, drawn out war over Gaza. I don't think they've settled based on what Blinken is saying and based on, even what Biden is purportedly has said that, again, more leaked sources in mainstream American media, and I don't mean Fox, who are saying, um, Israel has a few weeks, maybe a month, and they're going to have to wrap this up. We'll see. We'll see. But I say this only because it wouldn't be the first time that they would have to renege on their words. But I think maybe you know, America has a larger policy that um, is more encompassing than what Israel has and its interests. And maybe I think even Israel is not going to warrant for the U.S. to begin creating new munition factories and go on a war economy for them to win this war. I mean, Israel has wanted all that land for itself. Some of the hotheads there think Lebanon belongs to them. There was an IDF captain who was giving this speech. Um, so I think part of the establishment in both countries understands that, to get all this land is something that is going to take decades, right? So maybe this will be a phase, one of the most bloody in its history. But I mean, time will tell. But I do think it's moving in this direction. Um, I think like you brought up Nasrallah. His speech, for a lot of people, considering how many Palestinians have been killed, and now that number is 10,000 or close to 10,000, and about 4,000 are children. There's apparently over 1,000 children still under rubble. I don't know if that's part of the 4,000 figure for dead children, but uh, you know, Nasrallah, as you say, he kind of played it safe, but he's not the leader of a state. He's the leader of a political movement. And it's been a very intelligent political movement. They managed, after the long, bloody civil war in the 70s and 80s in Lebanon, most Christians trust Hezbollah. Hezbollah learned you know, um, from others' mistakes, from their own mistakes, and they've managed this very well. Also, about 5% of the Hamas government has Christian members in it. The government in Gaza. So there's not much they can do, and to offer a larger conflict to America, even if it doesn't go for a long time, America still has the capability for a short period to dish out so much damage that it could reverse certain processes that are taking place now, or halt them or slow them down dramatically. America, I think, is depending on a certain level of chaos. We talk from time to time about how things are moving, how there's this greater delineation between the Western world and the rest of the world, and you can call that multipolarity if you want, or it's a reaction to multipolarity. So it's navigating where multipolarity goes. Um, so I think, you know, countries like Iran and Egypt want to play it safe. And in many ways, although so many have been sacrificed in Palestine, um, you could say that Israel has tarnished its reputation for at least a generation, possibly two.
Yeah, there's no. I would say there's no
Integration
coming
and
back
normalization is not going to happen.
for quite some time. And another point that has been brought up since the beginning of this conflict, which I do think is I've probably also brought it up on the show before, but something that's also worth considering is as the situation becomes more volatile. I know you had mentioned the interview with the family that had said they're leaving Israel for good. A large part of the tactics of groups like Hamas are to shake the sense of invincible security that Israelis have in
Mm.
attempts to get them to just leave. Because the more that leave, the more that confidence shake in the state, the less manpower that they have. And while I'm not saying that Hezbollah and Hamas rockets can drive out the entire population of Israel, it has the potential on top of just actual damage of once again lessening that confidence in the Israeli government and sending the Israelis into the diaspora because almost certainly they have connections, they have friends, they have family who can set them up at all across the world. And just as you have the diaspora in North America, Europe, and elsewhere have their passports in their back pocket, you have plenty of Israelis with their American, UK, French, German, etc. passports in their back pockets. It goes both ways. So that's another factor they have to consider here. As the situation becomes more stable in Israel, as quality of life in Israel inevitably declines, there's probably a lot of people who have the means and the ability to get out that will get out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
I mean,
it's
they're going to have their hardcore supporters, and remember, Biden said if there was no Israel, we would make one.
oh, of course. If
So
there was no
it's
that, I'm sorry, that one just kills me every time.
yeah, it really is something, right? Like it tells you just the potential of this conflict, not just dragging on, but the scope it could reach. Um, but I think that Russia and China want to manage this now. Several countries, including even countries like Honduras, has has cut off diplomatic relations with Israel. Um, I suspect more of this will go on. Um, I know Israel wants this, and I think they have a great argument to convince the world, but it's not convincing the world. And in many ways, as America becomes more diverse, the world's diversity won't really allow it.
I know it'll never happen, but it'd be funny if Lula cut ties to Israel.
No, all the Brazilian Pentecostals.
Put Bolsonaro back in power in a coup just for the
Yeah.
sole purpose of restoring diplomatic ties with Israel. Yeah, but while not many major players have cut ties with Israel, because I mean we're talking Bolivia, we're talking Honduras. Not that these countries are nothing, but they're minor players, all things considered. They don't have much weight on
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
international stage. But once again, it's funny to see. It's very entertaining to watch happen.
Well, I
Regard,
think Jordan and Bahrain have all
yeah,
have
yeah. That's much more.
recalled their. I don't
That's
know
much
if
more
Egypt has
significant.
or not.
But yeah, Jordan has completely recalled them. Of course, there's the current dispute between Israel and Turkey. A lot of the Gulf states have pulled back on it. The UAE, strangely enough, is still maintaining ties with Israel, has been rather silent on the issue thus far, which probably just goes to show the level of compromise that the UAE ruling class probably is, which, I mean, I don't think that really shocks anyone. But it's becoming a much more unpopular and untenable position. And
Hmm.
if this really is responsible for another migrant wave, who knows what the ramifications of this will be in the West, and who knows how much. I mean, I think the Europeans have shown the degree to which they have battered wife syndrome just after almost 2 years of war in Ukraine. But the question is, especially with the pressure of another migrant crisis, how much will actually be tolerated? Now, unfortunately, I think the threshold for tolerance is very high given what we've seen just over the past almost decade out of Europe at this point. But maybe there's some latent shred of optimism in me that might say that maybe this is the wake up call. Maybe this is something that will make them reconsider the decisions that both at home and abroad that brought them to this point. But as much as it pains me to say, I doubt that.
Yeah, I think so.
Just the slow crawl towards the grave for Europe as a continent, which once again, I will reiterate, I take no pleasure in saying, but I don't even want to say they screwed themselves just because of the circumstances in which Europe has found itself in the past 80 years, but between an effort of those in Washington and the collaborators at home, it's. I know I've used this phrase a lot this episode in the past few episodes. It's a no-win situation, and there's really no way around that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess it has to play out. Um, but I think, the Arab countries in many ways are kicking the can down the road. Because of course, if Israel does successfully remove every Palestinian from Gaza, and a recent poll showed that 83.4% of Israelis do not want any cessation of the bombing. Netanyahu's popularity has cratered. It is under 25% of approval. And there was either a protest in front of his house or the Knesset, and demanding his resignation. I mean, he is toast once this is over, and we did call that. Uh,
That'll be funny
he's
at least.
wily like Erdogan, but I don't. This is not something he's going to survive.
Oh no,
This
no.
is no.
Um, like I said, maybe he can go back to Pennsylvania and throw in his hat for 2024, and Zelensky will get the prime ministership of Israel, and everyone will be happy. But maybe not. And I don't know if you have any last minute news stories to maybe
I,
not
I
end the
have an
show on.
Arestovych.
Oh yeah, Arestovych, go ahead.
Yeah, I love Arestovich. This has got to be one of the most hilarious things he's ever said. Oh, by the way, the five guys that were killed from the Ukrainian side at the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade attack. Colonel Volodymyr Vozny, Lieutenant Colonel Andrei Tarasenko, Major Sergei Kuznev, Captain Dmitry Milyutin, and Senior Lieutenant Pyotr Trofimenko. So some very, I mean, that's just huge. Um, the other was an attack. They've killed several journalists. There was a Palestinian journalist that was killed with 10 members of his family. One of the things that Palestinians do now is to, rather than be left with nothing, they go into their home together and decide to die together instead of, you know, dying, alone or being left alone. But there was also a Russian reporter, Russian Moscow-based reporter. He's not himself Russian. He appears to be Muslim, Arab of some kind. Samir Ayub. He was killed with a woman and three children when their car was hit in southern Lebanon by an Israeli missile. But you've seen this kind of thing. But anyhow, I'm digressing. I should get to the Arestovych. So Arestovych said, at the beginning of the war, I exaggerated. Um, yeah, this is it. A significant share of responsibility for the faith of the average citizen in our quick and beautiful victory lies with me personally. I created an illusion that time uh, at that time so that we would win. Today, I'm destroying it so that we can continue to survive. Oh my God. Oh my God.
You know, the world we need that we don't deserve is the. Do you know what the 2024 trifecta is?
Nah.
That is Arestovych in
Yeah.
Ukraine, followed by Medvedev in Russia, followed by Trump in the U.S. That is the trifecta that we need in
Yeah.
2024, and I
That
will
is
accept nothing
just
less.
incredible. So I lied to you about our inevitable and glorious victory because you needed that illusion in order to survive. Now I'm going to destroy that illusion because it will help you also survive.
Hey,
It's just incredible.
what
What a
if the
He
go?
never disappoints. He never. I love Arestovich.
Now hear me out. Based on Alexei's statements there. What if the real ghost of Kiev was all the friends we made along the way? I mean, but I can't wait for the first Trump Arestovich meeting. That's gonna be. Oh, it's the, I can't. I don't know whether Trump Arestovich or Biden Arestovich would be a better meeting. That's a hard one.
Yeah.
Oh, that's I'm so glad that he's a viable candidate for the president of Ukraine because this show would be ending on a very dour note otherwise. But that is the best quote I have heard from him after months
It
of
is. That
radio
has got to
silence.
be the best one.
That
That's better. That's better than even Klitschko. Remember
oh,
Klitschko?
oh,
He
of
was asked
course.
by a TV host interviewer, uh, "Would you die for Ukraine?" And he says, "That's simple. I'm going to survive for Ukraine because that's even more complicated." It's like it's unbelievable, just shameless. How did they not kill these guys? How did they not tear them apart with their hands?
How?
It's disgusting.
I mean, I
Like they accused the Russians of being slaves, and yet these people.
I find myself wondering where the hell Arestovich even came from in the first place. Like, where did they dig out this guy? It's
I think he's originally from Odessa, but I think he's a mix of Russian, Belarusian, Polish, and Ukrainian.
that explains the transient loyalties.
Yeah.
What hell of a mix right there. That's something else. But thank you, Mr. Arestovich. You have the full war report endorsement for your election campaign in 2024. And you know, we look forward to seeing you in office because that's what the Ukraine conflict and that's what the world needs right now. So thank you everyone for tuning into yet another episode of the War Report.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll see you guys next time.
Take care, guys.